said, which actually made me feel really disheartened. So it made me feel encouraged but disheartened at the same time.
Yeah, that's one thing I was like, okay.
Which was actually, okay, cool, like West Indian boys, or with the West Indian heritage, Jamaican heritage, whatever, they were doing really badly. In fact, they were at the bottom of the class. The question is, why? And so it kind of made me think, like, whoa, like I have a son who basically from a West Indian heritage. Obviously, I want to make sure that that's not his story.
Mm-hmm.
That he is exposed to the right education, appropriate education, that he has all the experiences and the chances, obviously, that he needs to thrive in life. And I'm sure that's the case with every Black family, whether you be from African descent or you're from the West Indies. The question is, what are the things that are kind of militating against that? And it's a serious thing. It's really concerning because it's kind of like, well, why is it that the Black,
now this is going to affect you directly now?
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Well, and I'm sure some people would, if they would hear that, will say, oh, well, what's the culture? They just don't take education seriously. They just don't take. They just don't have a serious approach. But you know, some people would easily write it off.
Yeah,
like that.
But that's the thing. It's, I don't know. It's again.
Here's the thing. I think on one level. Okay. First and foremost, I think we have to define culture.
Mm.
When we say culture, I don't think when people say, "Oh, it's just a culture." What I hope that they don't mean is, oh, the music that they're exposed to, the food, the fashion they wear.
Yeah.
I hope that that's not what they mean, because remember, culture. If we kind of like look at the root word cult, to cultivate something, to nurture something, it's that which nurtures an individual. It's the kind of the soil in which you were brought up in that ultimately directs the trajectory of your life and the scope of your thriving, let's say. Mm. But it's also true that people can overcome where they have actually first started. You don't have to finish where you started. Mm. You can actually thrive and kind of grow and experience different things and, become a completely different person to the person you started out being. An example for this is that, an example for the reality of reformation is when we take a person like a Malcolm X. And we know the story, obviously, the autobiography of Malcolm X, etc. We know that where he started off, how he started off being
Detroit Red, man.
Involved in criminal activity.
Yeah.
And, education transformed this, reformed his character to the point where now we're speaking about him in conversation as being one of the luminaries in the Black community. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is of course you don't have to end where you start, etc. But what I'm saying is where you start is still important. And what I think people mean by culture is, what are the values that are being instilled within you at a young age? What are you being exposed to at a young age? Because the reality is, if you have a family who may be working class, they may live in quite a deprived area. We could argue that in some deprived areas, there are trends when it comes to criminal activity. If a child is exposed to criminal activity very young, that can affect how they see the world. That can color the way in which they see things, and that can ultimately affect the way that they see education, and actually, perhaps they may not necessarily see the value in that.
Yep.
And I think also, sorry to cut you off, Andrew, but there's that element of people growing up in that environment, people external to that environment, it also affects how they see them. You know, maybe a teacher going into a teacher class in that environment would come in with a perception of those kids based on all of that type of stuff, right?
And now they're swept to the wayside, essentially.
Not given a chance.
And
expelled unnecessarily.
Or maybe not even unnecessarily, but just not given a chance to redeem oneself if you have made a mistake. Because I think you could argue that there are some cases where a child should be expelled. Yeah. But what about that restorative justice?
But it's case by case, I guess. And I suppose you have to figure out if there is any redemption in this particular child. I mean, there could be a case where two children do exactly the same thing, which should be an expulsion, right? And it's, okay, is this kid worth redeeming at all? Is there anything in him where we can reform him? Or is this other kid, you know,
is their parent a donor? Is their parent a donor to the school? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of, you know, things that you have to look at on the list and say, okay, you have to tick off. But going back to what we were saying about this particular child that's, you know, taken on a life of crime, you know, education is somehow seen as uncool. You know, I've known kids like this growing up. Oh, you're a nerd, you know, what are you doing? And I think I'm a firm believer, and I think especially within the Black community, we need examples where being smart is cool. I think we need this. And for me, again, growing up, I was always drawn to the smart characters, especially within fiction. My favorite turtle was always Donatello. Beast, I always liked him because of how intelligent he was. Granted, that's just me. But
so it wasn't the blue luxurious hair?
No. It was the smarts, man. Obviously, those tiny glasses and that big head and thing. But
something you can identify with.
Yeah. that's right, man. That's why I've taken on the persona, man, of Henry McCoy, man, Hank McCoy. But the thing is, I just think, being smart isn't very desirable. It's not. It's kind of looked at as, you know, it's not very cool. It's not going to get me those new clothes. It's not going to get me those girls. You know, I think that's mostly the case.
But I don't know if it's that. I see what you're saying, and I actually partially agree. But then I also want to slightly push back to say, I don't know if it's that simple. I think sometimes, because remember, Malcolm X was smart.
Yeah.
But Malcolm X was also a fighter. So it's
like the honey badger, man.
Sorry?
Honey badger. Like the honey badger, innit?
That's some esoteric. No one else is going to get that, but
I'll put the link down in the description, innit? Right?
Yeah.
Anyway, the point. I lost my train of thought. But the point is, anyway, is that he was also a fighter. So
with a clear cause
if you're smart, So if you're smart, I think I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think people actually. I suppose it depends on how old you are, I guess. I suppose back in the day, people did think, "Oh, yeah, you're a nerd," blah blah blah. But I wonder if that was projection. I wonder if that was simply just a defense mechanism at one's own difficulties, academically speaking.
Well, what about the pressure in a lot of these kind of communities? We know it. We grew up in that environment. That pressure, the pressure on us to be successful academically is born out of a pressure for us to earn money to bring into the family.
And obviously the pressure to not receive a slap.
No doubt. No doubt. But that pressure, that pressure to bring in money, that pressure to earn money, I think is also what contributes to some people seeking out a career in crime.
Yeah, because it's fast.
Or it's fast cash. It achieves the goal of bringing money into the family.
Yeah.
And that's easier for some people than studying, potentially.
Yes. But the trouble is, though, with that, is that as a result, we see black on black crime.
No doubt.
And as a result, we see many of our black young people dying needlessly.
Yeah. Which then gets broadcasted on news, like those kids in, what was it, Chiswick or whatever park it was with the machetes the other week. It gets broadcasted on the news, which then snowball effect creates that negative perception.
Now we're back in the loop.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we grew up in Brent, Hamza and I, we grew up in Harlesden. How many times, and particularly then, you know, now Harlesden is a little bit more bourgeoisie, you know, particularly when we were growing up, when you would say you're from Harlesden, how many people would say, you don't sound like you're from Harlesden?
Yep.
Or really? Like, and you've not been stabbed? You know, that when people see that, when the narrative is just violence and crime, people then see you through that lens of violence and crime. And I guess I have a concern is that if someone is in a position of authority or power or influence, and they see a kid with that background, is that affecting their judgment and denying that kid the opportunity that they are entitled to, the equal opportunity that they're entitled to?
That's the thing. I mean, unfortunately, sometimes it's true. But sometimes it just boils down to the child, ultimately. And the sad thing is, sometimes that child is not ready for it. Like, you might cross paths with this person that's trying to give you a chance. The child is not ready, and then,
Of course. I mean, for example, you often hear this thing like, I would have gotten this job, but it's because of the way I look, you know, or the way I speak, or things like that, which on the one hand, I can understand and I can understand it from both sides, right? That report talked about developing a new multicultural sense of the British identity, which I think is a fantastic idea, except that new multicultural sense of British identity needs to incorporate that guy that sounds like they've just walked off the set of walked out of a drill studio and walked into your interview. But just like how regional accents weren't popular on the BBC 10, 15 years ago, they are now. But people need to take that step to accept that kid with dreads, that kid with the braids.
That's a fair point. Like, okay, an accent is one thing, but how you speak is another. If you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So
that's true. That is true.
So look, this is the truth of the matter is communication is what helps a business thrive, or whether it's the news or whatever this is. Yeah. If you are not communicating well, what need is there of you or for you or of you? You know, like, why do we need you to kind of get our message across and stuff like this? So I don't know. It's like, the case a couple of months ago about, I think, was it kids with afros or hijabs? It was a particular school. I think a bunch of kids
cut their afros.
Yeah.
Or something.
And I think
blocking the view.
Yeah, which was, I mean, it's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. But as for, in terms of communication, I think that is very important.
Was it a shambles, Sam?
It was shambolic, yes, indeed. But in the case of communication, I think there is a case to be made there, to be honest.
I don't know. I see it from both sides, but we also then have to bear in mind that if someone denies somebody a role, and I don't think many people would openly say, I didn't give that job to that guy because I didn't like his cornrows, or I didn't like the way he sounded. I don't think many people would explicitly say that. But if they are making those types of decisions on those principles, that's how do we address that?
But Tunde, would you then argue, or could it be possible then that in that situation, we're not talking about racism. We could be possibly talking about elitism.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Classism.
Yeah.
But not racism. Because it could be that you're indifferent to the person's color. But like you said, they sound like they've just come out of solitary. So they may not necessarily be the right person that you believe. That, in your opinion, that will be the face of the company or the face of the organization. And yes, we know that is a kind of discrimination. But it's a relatively benign one. And look, I'm not saying this is correct. I'm just saying that it's benign in the grand scheme of, or if we want to look at the sort of
but not to the person, but not to the person that's been denied it.
Not to the person. No.
Yeah, it's very real. It's very
real. But then, okay, let's think of it this way: if a gay person turned up to an interview and in the process of the interview revealed that they were gay, and then the hiring party didn't hire that person because that person was like, I don't want to hire a gay person, right?
Right.
There would be a clear call for discrimination, right? On the grounds of that person's sexual orientation, right? If that were the case. If someone then presents with dreadlocks and they're not given the role because the person says, well, he's got dreadlocks, right? And of course, dreadlocks now are more of a stylistic thing than a religious thing.
Yeah, but he may not be Rastafarian.
He may not be Rastafarian, right? But you as the interviewer don't know that. And if you deny that person, it's discrimination.
You know? But it's not as clean cut, is that what you're...
It's not as clean cut. It's not as clean cut, and it's also not as well defended.
Okay, but then here's another example. You work in a confectionery shop, yeah. You work with sherbet, yeah. And maybe someone who happens to have a really, really bristly beard comes to apply for the job, and they look really unkempt. Okay. There will be a kind of discrimination.
Yeah, I see.
But it's a benign one. I don't want hair in my sweets.
Furry sherbet, no thanks.
But anyway, okay.
You know when the lolly looks like it's been dropped on the carpet?
It was been in your pocket or something.
Yeah. Some furry lollipop.
But you get what I'm saying. Obviously, look, we know that there are sort of you can get like hair nets and you can get beard nets. We know that. But I said that, to say that there are levels of discrimination.
Oh, I agree.
You discriminate on a daily basis. The fact that you're with the person you're with, Hamza, that's discrimination. It's true. You basically, in your mind's eye, had to kind of winnow through the people that weren't for you. They weren't compatible. You discriminated against those other possible honeys that could have been Ricky. Likewise, with myself, my other half, who is the best thing ever. Basically, obviously with her as well. She thought, you know what? There are other guys out there, but I prefer him. So on a very everyday level, discrimination has to take place. Yeah. And so that's why I'm saying there's a sort of a spectrum, let's say, when we're speaking about discrimination, which can begin really benign and can get kind of really quite icky for the scientific stuff.
Yeah. But okay, I don't want to labor the point about hair and things like that too much, because we might just over focus on that particular example. I guess really at the core of it is people will carry their biases and there will be some elements of discrimination. But if the things that are being discriminated against are, for the time being, statistically more associated with one particular racial group,
they're immutable.
They're immutable, then there is an issue.
No, there is. A case can be made.
Yeah. And that is a very tough nut to crack. Again, with this report, talking about education, great. It's good to see stats of kids from ethnic minorities doing well academically. But how much of that is translating into earning potential and employability, And one of the things on that report, it stated, I think, between, let's say, people of African descent, British Africans, and people of Caribbean descent, currently Africans were less likely to be homeowners than the Caribbean. The report puts that down to the African community on large being later into the UK than the Caribbean community and having less time to build generational wealth, right? That's one thing. But then that, to me, reads as being at odds with the academic prowess of these kids. So I read that as there being some type of disparity.
Yeah.
And again, why? So there's, particularly with that report, I did think that there are some things that we said, stones that need to be overturned.
But is it possible that there are just some things that create disparities that do not correlate directly to a defined reason?
I hear you. Like there could be cultural things. For example, if someone is a devout Muslim and insists on praying 5 times a day, and that interview is at the time of Zuhr prayer, they're not going to go. And you do see people who make those types of decisions.
There's people
right?
like that, yeah.
Yeah, who make those types of decisions. That could be a factor. But that's why it's so difficult, because these are things that we see the outcome. We can look at an outcome and say, exactly, and we're trying to just, figure out.
Exactly, so we're trying to redress or address some of what we perceive to be inequalities or disparities. Case in point, the case for reparations. Then, is there any real case for reparation?
Well, on a financial sense, we read that the article in The Atlantic, and I can't remember the author, Coates?
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I mean, in all honesty, he made a very compelling argument for not just financial reparations, but for a cultural type of reparation, and a national acknowledgement of past wrongdoings.
So like an official apology, kind of?
Drawing a line in this, like the official, okay.
But how would that
step past?
But what I was going to say is maybe it might be worth to know, if you want me to, you could just kind of give a bit of a summary to the case for reparations.
Well, go for it.
Okay, cool. So essentially, the case for reparations, I'd say, is kind of, it is part human interest story, part sort of socio-political treatise, I guess, and like a sort of part semi-religious exhortation almost. It's almost like this sort of liberal humanist exhortation, almost speaking to our humanity, let's say. And essentially, Ta-Nehisi Coates centers this very, very long article. I don't even know if that you can class it as an article. I don't know, that's a dissertation.
It's a book.
Exactly. He centers it on a guy called Clyde Ross, who was a citizen living within Chicago, a specific part of Chicago. I forget the specific area now, but a specific part of Chicago, who was given a sort of second-rate mortgage, which they called a contract. So, like, for example, with like normal mortgages, obviously you go to your lender, they give you a loan, you put down a down payment, which means that essentially you own a percentage of that property, and through regular repayments, you are basically given more percentage of that property in terms of the ownership of that property. And because of the fact that you own it, it actually operates as equity as well. So it's an asset that has debt, but it's positive debt, and ultimately you can have equity on that asset as well. But with these contracts, the Clyde Ross didn't actually own the property. The person who sold him the property kept the title deed, and he would only be given the title deed once the contract was paid off. Oftentimes, these contracts would be, in terms of the down payment of these contracts, would be far higher than a white counterpart. Sometimes $10,000 more, sometimes $15,000 more. Okay, so remember, essentially, it's not a real mortgage, so there's no equity, and also he basically doesn't own the property.
So this is just
it's a strange almost like rental almost.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, so what happened is that Ta-Nehisi Coates is speaking about this guy and how he was trying to get basically justice in regards to, this second-rate mortgage. And he speaks about, this group of people that came together. I believe they were first formed in 1968. I forget the name of the group that came together. But anyway, there was a group that came together to fight in Clyde Ross's corner. And there was a range of things that they did to try and get the sellers to to change the status of the mortgages. They tried strike action, where many of the 3,000 people that were given contracts just basically stopped paying rent. So that's one thing they tried to do. They also then finally took it to court, and they then won the case. However, only a few people were successful in getting their houses, basically, and getting these mortgages. And the rest of them, some of them lost their houses, some of them were thrown out, couldn't keep up with payments, etc. But Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't only center on that. He also speaks about the fact that the USA have a sort of legacy of mistreating Black people in that country, and how it started off with slavery. It then kind of morphed into Jim Crow, which was actually an epithet. It first started off its life as an epithet, which was based around this, I think it was like a blackface routine by this white entertainer. Yeah, and it was called Jim Crow, and then that epithet was used to describe the policies. Yeah,
that's where it comes from.
Yeah, it was used to describe the sort of segregationist policies that kind of then proliferated as a result. So then he speaks on slavery, then speaks about that sort of evolution to Jim Crow, and then he then speaks about redlining, how certain boroughs or certain communities only had Blacks living there, and it was a direct result of white flight, where you'd have these, I think they're called speculators, who would come into communities and they would basically fearmonger the white people within that community. So, for example, they may say to someone, there's going to be a huge influx of Black people that come into this community. It's best you sell your property now, or else the value of your property will go down. And so what happened is there was a sort of a mass exodus of white people leaving certain communities, and then there would be like an influx of Black people within these communities. Now, obviously, Ta-Nehisi Coates would say that that's kind of like, what's the word? What's the word I was kind of trying to look for? It's like social engineering. That's it. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like a social engineering through discrimination. And so ultimately he was saying, because of the legacy of slavery, because of the legacy of Jim Crow, because of the legacy of redlining, and then obviously, which is essentially social engineering, Black people are entitled to a repair on that damage or reparations. So that's kind of what the case for reparations is all about. And I think, Tunde, if you want to talk about the various reparations that he speaks on other sort of cultures, other groups of people receiving reparations as well.
Well, because typically when you hear the case for reparations, the immediate thing you think of is, well, It's not possible. There's no way you could afford it. There's no way that the money would be useful and the money wouldn't help anybody, etc. And then you reading through it, you wake up to the fact that actually after the Second World War, reparations were paid to Israel for taking on the Jewish community. And that money was used to bolster Israel and bolster its defense and arguably make it the dominant Middle Eastern superpower, right? And put it in a position of strength to operate from and become what is now known as the tech hub of the Middle East. And also from let's say from a cultural perspective, it allows, because some people could look at that and say, well, it's blood money. You're paying for the deaths of millions of people or whatever. But I think from a cultural perspective, it allows for drawing a line in the sand and being able to acknowledge that wrongs have been committed, right? So in a way, the fiscal element is not the real element of the reparations. It's more that national and cultural admission that wrongs have been committed against a group of people. And so from that point, we will all, move forward collectively and, seek to put that behind us.
Yeah, I don't know, man. But obviously, we also know about the Japanese Americans. They also received reparations. I think it was it directly after World War II?
Yeah.
And so apparently, I think it was 80,000 Japanese got something like $20,000 each.
Oh, after the internment camps?
Yeah. So they got $20,000 each, and I think when you add it all together, it was like 1.6 billion. Okay,
Yeah,
that's a big
especially
payout.
then.
Yeah, but it's funny because I don't know, man. For me, when it comes to the case of reparations, it's been done before, so it can be done. But I wonder though,
Where do you start?
Yeah, where do you start? I mean, also what you don't want is you don't want a sort of transactional answer to something which is, in a sense, is social in a way.
Yeah. The issue I find with that is that, when you have a problem and you procrastinate with it,
it just gets bigger
tomorrow. And it just gets worse and worse. And I think that is ultimately where this situation is. If you look at both of those examples with with the Jewish community and the Japanese community, the action was taken relatively swiftly after the closure of the Second World War.
To the individuals who endured the wrongdoing.
Exactly.
So they experienced from it firsthand.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And now, like Hamza saying, where do you begin? Where do you start? Where do you can take broad steps and say, well, we'll invest more in this community. But those communities now are a mishmash of people from different areas and different backgrounds and different socioeconomic backgrounds. The benefit of that, that the case for reparations article focuses on Chicago. If they just threw all their money into Chicago and said, oh, look, you guys bought some dodgy contracts. Here's your money. That isn't really targeting the broader spectrum of people that had to move socially. Even in that article, it describes how people from the South of the United States had to migrate to Chicago because of the Jim Crow era and the lack of opportunity. What about those individuals? Those families that have essentially ended their family line on account of lack of employment, depression, drug abuse. Now it's almost too big a problem to solve on that respect.
It's funny, there's a guy, economist called Glenn Lowry, right? And he said something which I thought was crazy, because he was saying, if you give a rough estimate to maybe how much the American government would have to give each individual black person in America, he estimated it being $100,000, right? If you were going to do like monetary reparations. But then he said, but the only difference is though, there are 40 million African Americans in America. If you give $100,000 to 40 million African Americans. I think he said there's something like $4 trillion. I mean, what the hell?
Yeah, that's
a lot of money, man.
America never gonna.
I don't know if America would be able to survive that, and socially and economically.
Well, now in our current economic climate, the world won't be able to survive it because that will just kick off like a massive amount of hyperinflation. We've suddenly given 100,000. You've got 40 million people with $100,000. They can all buy $100,000 or more stuff.
That's just in America. What about descendants of slaves that live here
or
now?
That
have emigrated out of that live in Australia, wherever the case may be. So that's this thing. How do you start realistically in a way that benefits everyone? One, and everyone is actually happy with. And
also as well, I just get the feeling though that not everybody would be happy with a transactional response anyway.
No way.
A transactional answer, some people won't respond to it.
Yeah.
Because it's a fundamentally it's a relational problem.
Yeah.
Transaction was a part of it. Yeah, if we're talking about slavery and even Jim Crow, to be fair, all of it, redlining, all of it. However, it's a relational problem that happened, and so it's really quite tricky. And the reason why I even bring up the case of reparations, look, it's not an easy topic to talk about, especially the fact that for just my own admission, I don't know enough about it. But what I will say is that just by sort of, in a sense, dipping my toe into looking at it and researching it, it made me realize that there are certain disparities that we perhaps will never be able to pay off. I think.
Yeah. Well, put it this way:
reality.
if the native Australians suddenly turned around and said, they did a Robert Mugabe and just said, "Hey guys, you want a country back?" You see what I mean? Like, we all know that wrongs have been committed, and I'm sure there are some people who massively disagree with what I'm saying, but I think, at least from the surface, it appears, maybe not Australia, but at least in areas like New Zealand, they tend to acknowledge the impact of Western colonialism in those areas and the impact it's had on local people and their development, right? And also their ostracization from society. There's an emotional reconciliation there, even with the fact that they do the haka in the rugby games. They proudly demonstrate the native culture. I think there's something powerful in that. It may not be a check in your bank account, to make you earn the same as someone who lives in Christchurch or whatever. I don't know. I don't really know New Zealand geography except for the Shire. But there's an emotional thing there, if you see what I mean. Like, you have some pride. There's a national sense of pride and you are added to the narrative of that country and the story.
The thing is, though, because so a part of me is thinking, well, is that how you redress 400 years of slavery?
Is it too late
because okay, someone might say, you know what, we're sorry.
My bad.
Yeah, we've changed the national anthem now, where a line talks about it. Is that enough to undo all the years of psychological pain
and trauma?
Well,
trauma.
Exactly.
The American Constitution, currently, it's still legally possible to own a slave. I think.
Is it? I thought but isn't the 13th Amendment?
There's some clause.
Doesn't the 13th Amendment kind of like?
Yeah,
but sure that doesn't occur.
There's some clause whereby I think if you are, essentially what it means is that people who are imprisoned can effectively be made slaves and be forced into labor. So it's technically, slavery is still technically not even.
Okay, so you're saying that maybe that it's only the sort of prison industrial complex that's affected by the loopholes in the 13th Amendment. I don't know. I just feel like people want to feel whole, right? People want to feel whole.
That they matter.
That they matter. But I don't know if you get there through transaction, because you cheapen what it means to be a human being.
Yeah.
You also run the risk of treating people like children, infantilizing people.
Yeah.
You run the risk of treating another human being as though they have no agency and no ability to, dig their heels in and actually make a life for themselves. And I don't know, that I think that's perhaps more damaging.
Yeah. But, I was just thinking, because I agree. I think the emotional reparation is more important than the financial, than the transactional side of it. But as I was just thinking that, I'm literally thinking we've got the European Championships kicking off. And only last week, England players took the knee to protest against, racism, particularly in sports and in culture. And as anybody who follows football in the UK would know, there's loads of black players that are continually racially abused playing on the pitch. And I was just thinking, that's in a way a country or people trying to acknowledge, guys, there's a problem. We need to move past it. Yet they're booed for it.
Yeah. I mean, I saw some of the people on the stands, obviously monkey gestures and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're booed for it. When even in, the Racial Disparity report, it does talk about this new British culture, that absorbs all of this, all of the different inputs from all of the different communities, this new British culture. But it seems, even though people are trying to manifest that, it's rejected. And I think,
but do you know what it is? Do you know why though? And I think it might have been Denzel Washington that said this. You can't legislate love.
No, you can't, right?
And what I'm trying to say is that if you try to force certain ideas down people's throats, right, they will recoil.
Yeah, there'll be a backlash.
I hear that. Yeah. But why is the New Zealand team doing the haka celebrated? The England team taking a knee booed?
Because taking the knee, and not only that, but that seemed quite local in terms of the haka. That seems quite local to the Aborigines, isn't it? That's very local to that group of people in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Right. Taking the knee is symbolic of BLM. And you could argue, because I haven't seen anyone since Colin Kaepernick.
Well, Colin Kaepernick.
Because remember, even Jesse Owens, when he put the fist up, that's different to the knee. The knee was something specifically we saw around the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was Colin Kaepernick.
Colin Kaepernick there, and a few other people, American footballers around the time for, if I'm not mistaken, was it police brutality?
Police brutality, yeah, against black individuals. Yeah. So I do think there's been a conflation of what taking the knee represents and what BLM represent. I do think there's been a conflation. But at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, you've got a national team, a national sports team. They're not, that's their form of speaking about it, right? They're not hurting anybody. Just like with the haka, that's the New Zealand team's way of showing their respect for the culture of the land. Right, that's their way of showing the respect. The funny thing is, I don't think people can see the things that are typed.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's their way of showing their respect for the land, right? It's if they did the haka, people celebrate it, right? If they did something, and don't get it wrong, I'm sure there are people in New Zealand that even say, why are they doing that?
Sorry. Go on.
Yeah, but I'm sure there's people in New Zealand who even say, why are they doing the haka? Right? Yeah. Why? That's not my New Zealand. That's a political gesture to show support for, for the native people.
Yeah.
Swings and roundabouts. The point is, they're making a statement And the statement, if you want to, because someone could argue, well, the hacker is political because, it's trying to show that, we made a mistake and other people are better. They're making a statement about a social issue, which
but then that problem is with that. If you perceive it that way, then you are the one with the problem. Just
like if you boo the England team taking
which I agree, is you are actively going out of your way to be kind of like pardon my language here, to be a prick. You're just, you're denying the truths of what people are actually experiencing. Look, you might not think it's true, racism doesn't exist. That person does, right? And you're not hearing him out. You haven't lived his experience. And a lot of people think because, he's a rich guy, whatever, he hasn't got problems. Hey, he's a human being as well. He's got problems just like you. He bleeds, all this kind of crap. But, so you're going out of your way just to be disingenuous, if you ask me. So
here's the thing. I'm not against the fact that they're doing that at all.
Yeah.
But I also understand that there may be some people that think, well, I'm here to watch a football game. And some people would like sporting events to be...
They don't want politics in it.
Why did we sing the national anthem?
What was that?
Why did we sing the national anthem before?
No, that's a fair point.
Well...
Yeah. I mean, then it shouldn't have any... There should be no signs of nationalism. I mean, then you can even argue, what's the point of having, an England...
Just play in grey kits. Just everyone plays in the same kit.
No, you have a point. You do have a point. But if you are a fan of football and you enjoy it, you should also, to some extent, there's politics in everything. I mean, we can't deceive ourselves here. There's some, even when you watch a film, Lord of the Rings, for example, right? Yeah, you can argue it's all fantasy, but you have to remember the author experienced, he was in World War I.
Yeah.
A lot of the things are allegories for what happened to him. There's, it is political.
Of course.
So for you to say that, I think you're being somewhat disingenuous. That's just my opinion. And I get what you're saying, Mike. Not everything has to have an overt political stance. This is true. But if you're a fan of football, I think it's only fair that you hear what these people have to say, at the very least.
But again, look, I agree with that. But at the same time, just to mention, just to put it out there, because obviously we're looking for nuance here. There may be some people that associate the knee with BLM, and based upon some of the things that have come out now recently about BLM, some of the founders of BLM don't want to associate themselves with it.
I hear that.
You can still, it's and this is, well, anyway, this is probably open another can of worms because we're talking about Black Lives Matter, because it's the whole idea about being behind a sentiment and not necessarily behind certain incarnations of the movement.
Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, because obviously that we could open. That's another.
That's another.
Maybe that's the next one.
I think so.
We're talking about this disparity, the perception of disparity, and the actual disparity, and it becomes harder to argue that there isn't disparity when each time someone tries to show their support or their attention towards it, they're criticized or booed. And in terms of that emotional reparations, there are examples where countries have been able to acknowledge and embrace the cultures that are around them and integrate that successfully. Whereas
they can coexist.
Yeah, it can coexist. Where it seems in other cultures, there's a resistance to it.
Mm.
And so when there is that resistance, it becomes harder to see, as that commission's report wanted to paint. It becomes harder to see this eclectic new Britain, this eclectic new culture where we embrace everybody's cultural backgrounds. It becomes harder to see it when each time it's expressed, it's shut down.
Mm.
That'll be my closing statement.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's a deep topic. There's so many knots to untie. really difficult to unpack. But what I will say is that all we can do, I guess, is, I suppose, if someone sees an injustice, is to actually say something. Don't be quiet if you see a genuine injustice. But at the same time, don't be too quick, to call something out as an injustice, if it isn't so. So it's essentially it's being cognizant of the fact that racism exists, racial disparities exist, but also being very aware that one has to take time in responding. You have to kind of think about whether or not what is what you're experiencing or what you see to be racism perceived, or is it something which is genuinely occurring? And we move forward from there. It's almost too big, in my opinion.
Yeah. I agree. Honestly, I couldn't have said it better. Just as I said earlier, your first thing shouldn't be to attack. If at all possible, educate and try to have a conversation with this person or these people. And I get it, we're all human. It's sometimes very hard to bite your tongue. But I would say, yeah, that's the end of this episode. Please let us know what you think. Please try and like and share, so we can get these to you and so we can have more interesting conversations with you guys. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.